Book 3, The Mansions of Idumea, Chapter 5. Sometimes it feels like the world's out to get me. An hour later, after the administrator's messenger left, the Shin household was bustling. Upstairs, Shem and Pato held up debris while Mahrree sifted through the drawers still trapped under the remnants of the roof to find clean clothing and bags. Jatsi was in the kitchen packing whatever kinds of food that remained that would travel well. Perrin was in the study, surrounded by officers the messenger had tracked down and sent to the lieutenant colonel's house. Major Karna, Lieutenant Rigoff, and Sergeant Major Neeks nodded at the instructions they received again. "Sir," Karna tried to assure him, "trust us. We can handle this. Finish your preparations and be on your way." Shin sighed. "I know, and I do trust you, but I feel like I'm abandoning Edge when it needs me the most. It's just, this is such an inopportune time to be leaving. 3 weeks, my mother's insisting, but I'll try to get back sooner." Sergeant Major Neeks cleared his throat. Rarely had anyone heard Grampy say anything important without clearing his throat first. "Lieutenant Colonel," Neeks started in his slow drawl, "with all due respect, the inopportune time to leave would have been 4 days ago. But now your rebuild Edge plan is in place, and we have plenty of work to keep each soldier busy and out of trouble for a long time. The Major has a plan for doling out the grain reserves. Rigoff has organized the effort to evaluate what food is left in the village, and we can certainly hold down the fort until you return in 3 weeks. You give my regards to the General and get out of our hair." He smiled firmly. "Sir," said Lieutenant Rigoff, "I have a concern about your house. Perhaps we should shift the schedule and get yours completed as soon as possible. I can have a detail of men here this evening to finish clearing it out, then begin rebuilding the roof in the morning." "I appreciate the thought," Shin told him, "but there are other houses in greater need. If we can just span the hole with a canvas tarp, we can close off the upstairs until I return. Keep to the schedule. I don't want anyone to think I'm getting special privileges." "So let them think it," insisted Neeks. "Your family needs to be safe. Let's get this house secured in your absence, Lieutenant Colonel." "It's the least we can do," Karna agreed. "Again, I appreciate the thought," Lieutenant Colonel said evenly as Zenas appeared at the door to the study. "But I think just posting a guard during the day and maybe 2 at night, as allowed by the administrators, will suffice." "You don't have to do that, sir," Zenas said. "We've already got it figured out." Perrin turned to him. "Who's we?" Mrs. Shin and I," Zenas corrected himself. One of Perrin's eyebrows rose at Shem's slip of familiarity. Each of the soldiers knew of the closeness between Zenas and the Shins, but still there were limits to be observed. Rigoff and Karna exchanged glances, and Neeks shook his head reproachfully at the younger sergeant. Zenas didn't see it. "We discussed it when we were in the bedroom," he told his commander, "and I was helping her with her clothes." Rigoff choked and Karna coughed nervously. The colonel's other eyebrow went up. Neeks's head shaking increased. Somehow Zenas missed it all. "You won't need a guard at night. I'll sleep here while you're gone," he grinned innocently, "and take care of whatever your bedroom needs." The lieutenant colonel went positively rigid. Neeks muttered, "Zenas, Zenas, Zenas." Rigoff and Karna glanced at each other anxiously. "Sergeant Zenas," Shin said in an eerily calm manner, "exactly what are you planning in my absence?" Zenas cocked his head, puzzled by his best friend's odd demeanor. "To do what you would do?" he squeaked. "Take care of needs?" The commander's expression remained wooden. The master sergeant was still perplexed. "May I get the coach now?" "Coach?" Shin spat. "What coach?" "The fort's coach." Zenas shrank a little under the furious glare. "Could use the airing out, really. Had it for more than 10 years, and I don't think it's ever been used. for Mrs. Shin to start loading? Shin squinted. I don't need a coach. Zena swallowed. But she and the children do? Comprehension hit both men like the sunrise. On Shem's face, it first glowed amused with a smile, which turned to abject horror. On Perrin's face, the effect was reversed. He began to grin in relief as Shem paled. Oh, sir, Sergeant Zena said tonelessly, a bead of nervous sweat breaking out on his forehead. You thought I was going to stay with your family while you were away. Do what you would do in the bedroom. Oh, no, sir. He's flushed redder than any man ever had. Perrin began to chuckle, and his men relaxed. A few looks were exchanged along the lines of, never was anything to worry about, right? Sorry, Zenas. The suggestion that you were going to stay with my family shocked me, Perrin said. But they're going with me. I think I need to sit down for a moment. An hour later, as the coach drawn by 4 horses left the Shin house, the 2 sergeants watched it head south, meandering as fast as it could through the rubble-strewn roads. When Neek saw all that Mrs. Shin and her daughter had shoved hastily into bags, he thanked the stars again he had never married. Should be an interesting 2 days and 1 night ride, Neek said to Zenas as they walked back to the fort. 2 teenagers locked up in the coach with their parents, and Mrs. Shin insisting the lieutenant colonel would be more comfortable down with them rather than up with the soldiers watching for danger. He shook his head and laughed softly. Zenas chuckled as well. None of his family has ever been to Idumea, and he's been avoiding going there for years. I don't know when I've seen him more anxious. Oh, I do. When he thought you were planning to move in with his wife, Neeks elbowed him. Ah, don't remind me, Zenas agonized, reliving the embarrassment. That was terrible. I can't imagine he even thought I would consider such a thing. He's probably just not thinking clearly, certainly surprised about the news of his father and his mother requesting they go to Idumea. Yes, Shem decided. He's just a bit overwrought. Imagine the worst. Well, I suppose that's how he got to be a commander, Grampy said. Zenas still shook his head. Grampy Neeks gave him a sidelong glance. You have to admit, though, you're always over there. It's just a little unusual. People may think things. The master sergeant furrowed his brow. Think what? What neither the lieutenant colonel nor the master sergeant fully understood was that those who served for an extended amount of time in the fort occasionally communicated about the relationship. Not with words, but with looks, especially when Shin sent Zenas to his house on an errand, or with the message that the commander would be coming home late. It was never more than Karna exchanging silent questions with Rigoff as Zenas bounded down the stairs of the command tower, or Neek scowling after him, then sending one of his meaningful squints to whoever was in the tower with him. Their eyes always said the same thing to each other. It's all right, isn't it? Have you heard anything worrying? Something the lieutenant colonel should be told? It wasn't that they doubted Mrs. Shin, it's just that, well, there was something about Shem Zenas. No one could put their finger on exactly what it was, but then again, his behavior was never less than exemplary. Maybe it was because Zenas seemed to be so pure, and no man was that pure. He never drank, never swore, never played dices, and in his free time, if he wasn't at the Shins, he was at the cottages, hanging out with the widows of all people. Not just Mrs. Pato, but all of her friends, fixing their fences, building them sewing tables, and sampling their newest recipes. He even spent many hours at Rector Young's, helping him to fix up the old place and tending to his garden. Zenas was faultless, charismatic, sweet, handsome, and seemingly perfect. which only meant that something was seriously wrong. But they just hadn't discovered what yet. It was almost as if there was another side to him, but just like the backsides of the moons, they could never hope to see what it was. So, like all good soldiers, they kept a careful watch, waiting for him to finally slip. No man was that good, without some secret part of him being bad. But, on the other hand, all of this had been going on for years, and no rumors of anything unsuitable had ever surfaced. So, the senior soldiers didn't worry about it and generally ignored their concerns. Until awkward and unguarded moments suddenly popped up, such as referring to Mrs. Shin by her first name, and realizing that maybe Lieutenant Colonel Shin had his moments of doubt as well. Otherwise, why would he have assumed the worst intentions about his best friend? The road the two sergeants walked was relatively free of foot traffic, since most of the village was moving rubble. Now was the perfect time, Grampy thought, to maybe get a peek at the other side of a moon. Neek smiled amiably. "Sergeant, how old are you now?" Zenas looked at him as they headed north to the fort, not sure why he asked the question. 34, beginning of the season. "And you've been here for what, 13 years now?" "Almost 14, at the end of planting." 14 years, mused Grampy. "Lots of time to see lots of things, right?" "I suppose," Zenas said, still sounding lost. Neeks almost chuckled. It was just that Zenas was so, well, naive wasn't the word. It was as if he simply didn't notice things or pay attention to what everyone else did. And Neeks wondered that Zenas hadn't yet married. Mrs. Shin always had her eye out. Poor Milo Rigoff hadn't been at the fort for 5 weeks when Mrs. Shin, upon meeting the lanky officer, developed a gleam in her eye and told him she knew the perfect girl for him. And Mrs. Shin was rather put out, Neeks assumed, that Karna found himself an interesting young woman without her assistance. More than once Grampy had caught Mrs. Shin's attention, and the busybody was always ready to tell him about another one of her mother's lonely friends, but Neeks put an end to that every time with, "If she's not Army-issued, she's not for me." Mrs. Shin was likely still trying to find Zenas a female, or so Grampy assumed. Zenas noticed women. Grampy was sure of that. It was hard not to. There was a steady stream of them on the road to the fort. Since the land tremor, activity had gone down, but not completely. Neeks had noticed the parade of women had grown over the years. Maybe when the fort expanded to 250 men, so did the hopes of the women, both young and not so young. Edge may have just been a small village with only 5,000 people, but the soldiers never complained about lack of company. Even now, as they walked to the fort, Zenas nodded politely to what Grampy would consider a sultry and silky young woman, who approached from the opposite direction. Grampy surreptitiously watched Zenas's eyes as they got closer. Neeks definitely saw a spark. Then Zenas's eyes traveled down to the low-cut neckline on the young woman's dress, which left little for a healthy man to imagine. And Neeks was sure Zenas was a very healthy man. Zenas's face flushed with what seemed like shame at having lingered at her ample cleavage, and he looked at the ground, probably not even noticing the slit on her skirt that revealed her leg all the way up to her thigh when she walked. The girl misinterpreted Zenas's meaning and grinned flirtatiously, but Zenas kept his eyes on the road as she passed them. The young woman's expression turned disappointed, as Zenas refused to look up, but Grampy nodded courteously. While she wasn't interested in the older man, she nodded politely back. Grampy's thoughts churned. Maybe Zenas thought he had already found himself a woman. When the girl was sufficiently behind them, Neeks cleared his throat again. "How is it, Zenas, that after all these years in the Army, you—" He faltered, unsure of how to finish his thought suitably, yet still get his meaning across. Yes? Zenas asked, looking at him askance. Well, on your days off, you're not in the market enjoying a drink or chatting to some beautiful young lady. I have a hard time believing that what they might call a ruggedly handsome man like you can't find someone to talk with. Zenas smiled sadly. None of the women here are the kind I would want to talk with, he said, missing Grampy's insinuation that no conversation was implied. I'm a little particular when it comes to women, I suppose. Doesn't have to be a long-term commitment, Sergeant. Most of these women aren't looking for a long conversation. Zenas sighed. Well, maybe I am. Things have changed since I first came. It's getting harder to find nice women. Nice women like Mahrree Shin, Neek said with a hint of accusation. Zenas's eyes flared at him, then softened. Yes, like Mrs. Shin. He took a deep breath. Grampy, she's so much like my sister. And the lieutenant colonel, he's the brother I should have had. They remind me a great deal of what I left behind. I'm a family man, and they're my family. That's all. Grampy had stopped walking, forcing Zenas to pause and pivot to face him. Neeks didn't say a word, but folded his arms and gave the master sergeant a look. Zenas knew what he was implying. Even if I wanted one, I'd never have a chance, Grampy, Shem said quietly. She's completely devoted to him. And so am I. Grampy stared him down for another half-minute, but Zenas held the gaze intended to determine just how honest the younger man was. You better be, Grampy said coldly. He's the entire reason I'm an edge, Grampy, I promise. Realizing that was about as clear an answer as he would get, Grampy nodded once. Make sure it stays that way. Then, as if the last exchange had never occurred, Grampy unfolded his arms and continued walking to the fort, Zenas falling in next to him. Well then, family man, Neeks drawled in his lazy tone onto another subject. You might want to recommend to the Shins to lock up that daughter of theirs for the next 10 years. She's quite a developing young woman, isn't she? Zenas rounded on him. How dare you talk about Jatesy Shin that way? She's only 14. It would take a lot more than that to rattle Neeks. Taller than her mother already, although that's not saying much. But Zenas, I've seen some of the soldiers noticing her. The colonel's dark eyes and her mother's features. Neeks shook his head. I'm warning you, Sergeant, that girl's getting attention when she comes to the fort. She's just bringing her father a meal or a clean undershirt. But Zenas was visibly disturbed. That can't be, he decided. She's only a girl. Up until a few years ago, she still sucked her thumb when she was nervous. I thought Mrs. Shin said she'd celebrate her 15th birthday in Idumea. So? Many girls get married at 16 or 17. Startled, Zenas said, What would a soldier want with a 16-year-old girl? Neek sighed loudly. Zenas, how is it that you've been in the army for so long and are still so, he searched for the right word, innocent? Zenas regarded him for a moment, puzzling out his meaning, and scowled when he understood. I choose to be, Neeks, and I really wish I could stay that way. But it's getting a lot harder. Sometimes it feels like the world's out to get me. There's a great deal of romantic mystique that accompanies riding in a coach behind 4 fast horses on the way to a huge city and an unfamiliar place. If that mystique lasted more than 5 minutes, the trip would be pleasant enough. But when 3 occupants of the coach become ill from the rocking before the coach even leaves Edge, 2 days and a night might seem like a very long journey. And it was. Under different circumstances, it might have been exciting. They might have remembered to take books to read or paper to write on. But instead, each of the riders in the coach was left to wonder what lay ahead, besides the headache and nausea of being bumped around unpredictably. After an hour of headbanging, Pato discovered how to hold his body limply enough to roll with the jostling instead of fighting it. His mind wandered to Idumea and meandered its way through what he imagined would be crowded roads and narrow houses, to the one place he hoped circumstances and time would permit him to see, the new kickball stadium. Sure, he was worried about his grandfather, and in a way it was Ralph's fault. Pato was thinking about the massive arena right now. General Shin went on and on last year about the enormity of the structure, so that Pato was hanging on his every word, while his father just sneered. Why would 50,000 people want to be crammed together in one place? Pato tried to remember how his grandfather responded to that. Something about parent cynicism, lack of appreciation. Pangs of guilt hit Pato. Were those some of the last words he heard his grandfather speak, but now he couldn't even remember them? Nah, he concluded, it's not like the High General could be snuffed out that easily. Nah, he'd be fine. Maybe even take Pato himself to see the arena once he regained his strength. Pato glanced over to his father, sitting across from him and staring out the window. Brooding so intensely, Pato felt the air around him grow heavy and dark. Perrin Shin never wanted to go back to Idumea, but now their entire family was rushing to the hated place. The Shins wouldn't be making this journey unless... Pato couldn't bring himself to think about the awful reasons, but instead sighed wretchedly about being such a selfish grandson. Jatsi, seated next to her brother, stared out her window, but her thoughts were solidly in Idumea and the dress district her grandmother told her so much about. It wasn't that fashions interested Jatsi that much, but it would be, interesting to see what others were wearing. Maybe she could find skirts and tunics that were bright and bouncy, something still fitting her parents' idea of modest. Maybe she and her grandmother could... Immediately, she was ashamed. There she sat fantasizing about shopping in the fashion center of the world, Idumea, when people in Edge were struggling to clean up. Her grandfather might be near death, and her grandmother was so consumed with worry that she actually ordered the Shin family to Idumea. And all Jatsi could wonder was if silk came in orange. She stared miserably out the window. Across from Jatsi sat Mahrree, too lost in her own thoughts to notice her daughter's eyes filling with shameful tears, or to notice that her son was unusually quiet. A part of her had always been wanting to see the city, just to understand what all the fuss was about, and why her in-laws always pressed so hard for them to visit. She wondered if everything Perrin had dismissed about Idumea was entirely accurate. He could take things a little far sometimes. Then again, she couldn't shake from her mind that Idumea was founded by the 6 men who murdered the first guide, Hiram. Then yet again, even though evil men had begun it, surely not everything was tainted by their influence. Some of it had to be fine, because she knew of good people who came from there, her in-laws included. And now she knew why they'd kept popping up in her thoughts all morning. It was as if the Creator wanted to give her a little warning, and she was grateful for it. But what would they find when they finally got to Idumea sometime later tomorrow? Mahrree tried to shove that worrying idea away, only to find another ready to take its place. She was headed straight for the city that housed Chairman Mal and the administrators. Over the years, Mahrree had tried to swallow down her own anger with their ever-increasing controlling tactics, and found ways to subtly skirt the teachings of the administrators with her students and children. But what if she came face to face with one of those men, and he saw the disdain in her eyes? Surely 1 or 2 might come by the home of the High General at some point. At least she knew a little about each man, thanks to what she had to teach her students about them. She never thought she'd be almost grateful for the 15-minute government appreciation lecture she was required to deliver each day, included with the teacher's scripts, which she normally ignored. Along with reciting the dry homilies, which emphasized dubious improvements to the world and the need for loyalty, she also had to read out loud about the backgrounds of each of the administrators. Naturally, Mahrree was suspicious about those and intrigued that the author of the scripts had, behind his name, the curious words public relations. At first, Mahrree's students were almost genuinely interested in the tales of each man. But by the time they reached the sixth administrator, several boys pointed out that they had heard the story before. Mahrree had to agree the similarities of their backgrounds were opportune. All 23 men had been conveniently raised in poverty, suffered great hardships, lost one parent or both, worked up to 3 jobs, 20 or more hours a day to afford a university education, although they must have reckoned time differently back then, and then later made an amazing discovery, or single-handedly fought and killed a garter, or rescued a woman/child/kitten in distress, and was so moved by the experience that he now wanted to rescue the world. One remarkable administrator, the only one Perrin said was worth more than a sliver of silver, Dr. Brizac, even made a great discovery about the effects of noxious gases on the human body while fighting a garter near a bubbling mud volcano in order to rescue an old woman who was holding a kitten. The woman was naturally a widow and poor, and it was raining, and then it turned to a blizzard, naturally. After reading that story to her skeptical students, Mahrree concluded the words public relations meant professional, if unoriginal, storyteller. Perrin had merely scoffed at the story. I bet Brizac hates cats, and old women, and snow. Mahrree grudgingly had to admire the calculated manipulation of the administrators to assure the citizens that they were one of them. The students were to share the stories with their parents, and after that year, all the citizens felt some odd kinship with the administrators. She wasn't surprised then when Ralph Shin later read through the script she showed him, raised an amused eyebrow and said, "So Gayak's parents drowned when he was just 13? How tragic. Perhaps I should tell Gadaman to investigate the old people that live in his mansion, who he calls mother and father." Remembering Ralph Shin's words brought Mahrree's thoughts back to why she was in the coach, which was shockingly quiet considering it held 4 Shins. She glanced around and noticed each member of her family stared gloomily out the windows. She sighed. The day had started out rather promising, well, except for raccoons stealing her stockings and her dismal evaluation of their food supplies and facing her ruined bedroom. All right, nothing about today had been going very well. Still, she tried to think of something mundane as the fields flashed past. But instead, other concerns filled her mind, keeping her from seeing anything but blurs. She watched her husband, hoping he might give her a comforting wink, but he seemed exceptionally sullen as he scowled out the window. There were a few things Perrin and she never discussed. When she occasionally attempted to bring up those subjects, Perrin would send her a calculated glare which meant to just drop whatever she was trying to express, and she always did. But now, thinking about what happened with the High General, she couldn't. What would happen if someday Perrin went off to stop a raid or investigate a threat on the edge of the forest and never returned? What would their family do in the event of his no longer being there? Even though all the gold and silver hidden in the cellar would undoubtedly provide for them, she could never bring herself to ask him. Nor did he ever bring up the topic himself. But a competing concern was the fact that Ralph Shin was only 2 years away from retirement, and that a new High General would be appointed. If they reached Idumea and found the worst had transpired, a replacement would be named in the next few days. Chances of it being Perrin were slim. He was only a lieutenant colonel and had enjoyed that ranking for nearly 8 years, since it was 2 rankings away from general. He didn't want to be High General. He rarely said that to Mahrree, but she could read it in his eyes. They grew even darker and more brooding when Ralph and Joanna visited each year and told their son about Idumea and their expectations. One small part of Mahrree wondered if this was a real emergency in Idumea, or if it wasn't some elaborate trick Perrin's parents were playing in order to get him to finally bring the family to see them. But Mahrree quickly dismissed that thought. As sneaky as her mother-in-law could be at times, she'd never drag her son away from a real disaster and edge unnecessarily. Still, Ralphshin had been actively campaigning for his son to become a high general ever since Perrin enrolled in command school at age 18. But Mahrree couldn't imagine a life away from Edge. Even though the topography at Idumea with its massive hot pools intrigued her, it could never be home. But as the coach raced south, she couldn't ignore the dread that she might be rushing to her new home. She'd even hurriedly packed Perrin's dress uniform, littered with medals and ribbons, not really sure why. She watched Perrin again, trying to discern what he might be thinking, but he just glowered out the window. Perrin knew his wife was looking at him, but he wasn't in the mood for one of her "what are you thinking" conversations. She didn't understand what every man knew. There were times he just needed to let his thoughts wash over him. And so he sat, mile after mile, for hours, mulling over two thoughts. The first, how would he react when he came face to face with administrators he'd successfully avoided for 16 years? Masking his contempt from 80 miles away was easy, but in the same room as them, a bit harder. The second thought, Mother, why did you wait so long to send for me? Two men sat in the dark office of an unlit building. Not that I would ever profess belief in an intelligence greater than mine, Mal said, but I dare say that nature had a far better idea than I did for revisiting Lieutenant Colonel Shin. Magnificent set of circumstances. Ralph hanging limply on the edge of his death, and his son rushing to Idumea, unsure of what he'll find. I can almost taste the tension. Brizek chuckled. Every now and then, the random forces of nature seem to almost gain a consciousness, to conspire together for a remarkable result. We couldn't have done it better ourselves. I must admit, I'm looking forward to bringing our boy Perrin home for a while. Nico clasped his hands on his lap and sighed. So many possibilities now, and so many more friends for him to get to know. I can hardly wait. And that's the end of the chapter. Thank you.